the Fusil Automatique Léger rifle fired at the Russians. Every time the trigger was pulled, the rifle sent a message to the enemies that they would not get through. The Brazilians defending the trench were focused on surviving and fulfilling their missions. That was not an easy region to fight in. The Russians were devastating the forest with their bombings. After the cover was destroyed, they sent their infantry into combat. In the midst of all this, Charlie Company, commanded by Brazilians, remained resilient against the threat. The beginning of the war in Ukraine reverberated brutally throughout the world. The images that began to emerge quickly had an impact on people. One of the largest armies in the world began a full-scale invasion against the country it had been fighting since 2014. But until 2022, it had been using the rhetoric that what was there were separatist groups that just happened to have Russian weapons. The videos that reached Brazilians sparked protests from some people or celebrations from those who were rooting for Russia to reach Kyiv in 3 days. It seemed like they would make it. In those days, Russian columns dominated the Ukrainian roads. Some Brazilians who witnessed that felt outraged and decided to take action. They packed their bags and left, answering the call for support from the Ukrainian president who created the International Legion of Ukraine. A group of fighters that would be part of the armed forces, but they didn't need to have Ukrainian citizenship. This concept of foreigners within a country's armed forces might even seem new, but it has existed for years in troops like the French Foreign Legion or the Gurkha Brigade, made up of Nepalese within the British Armed Forces. Each one with its own particularities, of course. It was common to see foreigners fighting in the Ukraine conflict since 2014, mainly on the Russian side. The separatists had forces like the Pyatnashka International Brigade, which would later become official within the Russian armed forces. So, it was not a surprise in the region when the International Legion was formed, and even less so when Brazilians answered the call. There had already been Brazilians fighting on the Russian side since 2014. Some who were enchanted by the call of glory found a harsh reality. Many of them didn't last long, especially after realizing that in war people shoot back, and often with much larger caliber rounds than anything seen at any shooting range. Others stayed, facing the horrors of war with steadfast hearts. Soon, the first news about the participation of Brazilians appeared in the media. Andre Barre from Rio Grande do Sul was the first to be declared dead in the conflict. He was 44 years old when he was fatally hit by the Russians in June 2022. Douglas Burrigo, 40 years old, arrived in Ukraine a month before Andre's death. He was on a mission with 2 other Brazilians, one of them being Thalita Duvail. She was 39 years old and worked as a rescuer in other battlefields, such as in Iraq. When they hid from the Russian artillery in a bunker, a fire broke out. The group fled, but Dulis realized that Kalita had stayed behind. He went back to save her, but a new Russian bombardment ended both of their lives. That was in July 2022. After that, there would still be many stories to tell, and one would attract special attention, but with a different background from those reported. Brazilian soldiers joined together in a company to turn the battlefield in their favor in the Ukrainian forests, and a special shout would unite them in these battles. Igor Gomez reported to the 204th Territorial Defense Battalion of Ukraine to fight on the Bakhmut front. When he arrived, the city had already fallen to the Russians. The battles didn't become any less intense because of that. He was greeted by Brazilians who told him not to stay, he would die there. Bakhmut was a meat grinder for both the Russians and the Ukrainians. The explosions around the city did not discriminate between the lives they intended to take. He immediately received orders to take up a position. The armored transport would take him a few hundred meters from the location. Aware that nothing in war was easy, Igor gathered his equipment and set out on the mission. He was dropped off more than a kilometer from the position. Poor planning made him run through a valley of fire, jumping from hole to hole in the middle of the hell that the Russians unleashed on his life. They were lucky to have made it alive to the shelter. Dirty and hungry, they stayed under position, living with the Russian threat even at the moment of extraction. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians tried everything they could to stop the Russian advance. Their drones flew against enemy military transports, blew up the vehicles they could, preventing the transport of ammunition and soldiers that would be used against positions like Igor's. Danger was lurking around Bakhmut. Antonio Ashtitani was 25 years old when he arrived in Alcantara. He dropped out of medical school in Brazil to do volunteer work in Tanzania, and from there he went to Alcania. When he received the mission to advance toward Bakhmut, the bombs were falling at a rate that pleased death. 3 others from his group refused to go on, but he joined a few more who walked to the requested position. It turns out the Russians had their spies in the sky. Ashtani's position was reported to the artillery. The Brazilian's shelter was hit directly. He was the 5th Brazilian killed in combat in Ukraine. Igor learned of the orders for Ashtani's body to be recovered along with the others who were killed. The 7 soldiers who volunteered got into the armored vehicle, aware that the Russians were watching. Under bombardment, they advanced towards a horizon of pure devastation. The road was full of craters. During the advance, Russian artillery managed to lock onto the group. The 7 died that day. Igor was lucky to survive there. It wasn't enough to be good to be an exceptional soldier. No combat experience can overcome a 122mm mortar falling on a man's head. Poor planning only increased the risks. He heard about new leadership in a company of the International Legion, one that was making a difference in the forests further north. Tired and hungry after months of tension, he took the train to his new destination. The sweat of war still clung to his body. The mud from the previous days seemed like it would never leave him. The sound of backwoods bombs still echoed in his dreams when the train stopped at the destination station. There, a bearded man greeted him wearing shorts and flip-flops, looking like he had just come from the beach and not from the same war where Igor had been. With a smile on his face, he handed a can of condensed milk and some cookies to the hungry soldier. Igor, his soul still weary from the days in Bakhmut, looked on suspiciously, seeing that smile half hidden in the thick and carelessly unkempt beard. He looked like Aquaman, only on vacation. Igor wondered where he had ended up. Igor didn't ask many questions at first. He was starving. The adrenaline from the days of battle left his body during the trip, which allowed exhaustion to take over his spirit. He arrived at the legendary house of Aquaman, where he was welcomed with the typical happiness of Brazilians. The name of the house came precisely from the nickname by which Ivan, the man who welcomed them at the station, was best known in Ukraine, Aquaman. Besides Ivan, there were other soldiers from different parts of Brazil and some from other nations. Igor had already noticed from those looks that there was something different about that battalion, but he waited to confirm it. Ivan Kruger welcomed his new soldiers with satisfaction. He was glad to have a soldier like Igor in Charlie Company, another Brazilian who would add to the team he was turning into a new force in the forests of Lyman. A former Brazilian army soldier, he arrived in Ukraine with firm ideals to take part in the war. He knew that pure ambition or money doesn't sustain a man's heart in the face of Russian bombardment. When he joined Charlie Company, there was little to praise. The group lacked organized leadership. There was little modern military doctrine being followed to reinforce the soldiers' orders on the battlefield. The role of Charlie Company which was under the command of Ukraine's International Legion, was to guard a series of defensive positions within the forests, specifically in the Kremina region. Russian soldiers were already putting pressure on the region before Ivan arrived. Moscow's battalions had heavy artillery moving in to open fire on the Ukrainians. The TOS-1A, or literally TOS-1A Scorching Sun, moved through the trees. The crew was made up of men from the troops known as the Braves. Although the name is sometimes heard among other military formations, that one specifically was the Central Military Group. They positioned the TOS-1. The soldiers spread out to protect the equipment, while the crew prepared to unleash hell on the targets. The thermobaric missiles flew up to 6 kilometers into the forest. The TOS-OM was an efficient rocket launcher. Mounted on the chassis of a T-72 tank, it had a good operational range, being able to travel up to 500 kilometers. The impact of its rockets was pure pain. The arrival of the thermobaric missile fired by the TOS-1 was devastating. The warhead released a cloud of flammable aerosol that, when it exploded, unleashed a wave of overwhelming heat and pressure, consuming oxygen and reducing everything around it to ashes. Trenches collapsed, soldiers in fixed positions were crushed by an invisible force, and the very air turned into an instrument of death. The deafening roar gave way to a tomb-like silence. There was no possible defense nor any acts of heroism in the face of its power, only stunned survivors, some with torn lungs, all with faces marked by horror. The artillery of the 144th Russian Motorized Rifle Division took part, with cluster bombs exploding along the edge of the forest. The trees along those defenses disappeared, just like Ukrainian lives. A precise throw by a Russian put a grenade inside the Ukrainian shelter. The infantry of the 144th Division sent its men into those devastated areas to finish off the Ukrainians still alive in those holes. The corpse of one of Kiev's soldiers lay in the trenches. Those attackers were, more precisely, from the 488th Regiment under the 144th Division. They waited for a while. The view was difficult because of all the broken trees. A Russian tried to throw another grenade, but it hit the tree and came back almost to his position. He shielded himself from the blast. His comrade was luckier, hitting the explosive in front of the enemy shelter. The Russian soldiers readied their rifles, but they couldn't see the Ukrainians. Another grenade flew and landed in the enemy trench. The drone reported no movement, which sent one of the soldiers marching forward with determination. He approached with his finger on the trigger, firing to prevent any enemy reaction. The second man also moved forward. A third man stepped up to cover his comrades so they could clear the trench. It was a difficult situation, with the bears constantly gaining ground. Ivan and the Brazilians arrived to change the course of the fighting in those forests. The Ukrainians were good at what they did. It was no wonder they had been resisting one of the largest armies in the world for 2 years at that time. But in war you have to adapt. Soviet doctrine was still deeply ingrained in many brigades in Kiev. In the International Legion, there was such a diversity of individuals that it allowed us to try some new things, even with Brazilians crazy enough to take risks even under the Russian storm. Ivan took on the weight of leadership in the forests of Lyman. The burden fell on his shoulders. His determined eyes looked at his comrades, and the sight of so many lives filled him with strength, making him stand tall under the weight of that mission. It was his responsibility, and that gave him strength instead of consuming him. He began to carry that burden as he walked with his soldiers to the trench. The defensive line had different positions, and Ivan gave each one a name and divided the team. One of his first steps was to trust and inspire trust. He gave responsibility to each soldier. Men like Capoeira, Trauma, Periquito, Barba, Pitbull, Braddock, and Igor were there fully aware of what war was. There wasn't a single one among them pretending to be a soldier. No one was there without knowing the reasons, without knowing what to do. The briefing was delivered in an imposing voice to attentive ears that understood the importance of each order for their own lives and for the lives of others. That group was trustworthy. The Brazilians there had strong fingers pressing the triggers and the motivation to keep their spirits from breaking when the first Russian bombardment hit. The Russians pressed the positions commanded by Ivan. The Brazilians' rifles sang in the trench. Its deadly sound traveled to the Russians, bringing death down upon the soldiers from Moscow, who were trying to attack Charlie Company. The Russians tried to set the pace, but they ended up dancing to the Brazilian music. The sound of the Fusil Automatique Léger stood out among so many AKs. Laying down fire in the forest, Aquaman walked through the trench, analyzing every space between the trees until he spotted the Russians moving. The Fusil Automatique Léger did its job, putting some Russians to rest, permanently relieved from the effort of war. Eyes had to stay sharp. The spirit couldn't give in to chaos. From the noise of so many shots, it was necessary to control the finger on the trigger. The Russian shots hit the trench and Ivan moved looking for the enemies. The mind could focus on the Russians because he knew he had reliable team leaders with initiative to hold the enemy in their positions. Even so, part of his thoughts was still concerned about his comrades and the orders throughout the trench. After all, they were all his responsibility. The bears were trying to surround the Charm Company, which caused the fire to spread over an even larger perimeter in the forest. Ivan watched the enemy's movement. An rocket-propelled grenade was launched from up ahead against their flank. The Brazilian's rifle unleashed its 7.62mm gifts of death. Aquaman realized that the pressure was increasing. He ran to trigger the explosive trap they had set up before the attack. The noise echoed outside. Satisfied, he returned to the gunfight. Thor didn't like to stay still. He needed to sing some violent minor songs to put some Russians to sleep. Some enemies were crawling among the trees ahead. The sharp eyes noticed. The patient finger moved. The projectile flew. More shots were fired as long as the Russian attack lasted. Ivan moved into position, improving his view and at the same time making himself less of an easy target. The rifle was hot, making its noise while there was still a trace of some Russian moving around. There was a silence after the sound of the rifle. Aquaman made his taunts. The party was good that day, but he called for trouble and they answered. A tank from Moscow approached, probably from one of the tank regiments operating in the region, like the 26th or the 59th. The cannon fired the shells into the middle of the trees. The explosions broke the trunks. The sand rose with each impact. Branches flew through the air. The shrapnel spun randomly, hitting those unlucky enough to be in front. Even the bravest hearts trembled in the face of the explosions. Ivan looked at Pitbull, another one of the Brazilians, and saw the young man with wide eyes. His years in the Brazilian armed forces hadn't prepared him for that horror. Aquaman laughed in the middle of an explosion that made the smoke swallow them completely. The laughter made the men look. Then in the middle of the horror, one of them looked seriously at Ivan and said, "Look, you have to stop getting into these messes, man." Covered in dust, bleeding, some half deaf from the noise of the explosions, all the Brazilians got the reference. Ivan laughed, looked at the forest and shouted, "Sparta!" The Russians heard it and realized that their cannons hadn't broken the spirit of Charlie Company. Ivan led them to victory for one more day, knowing that no leader wins without competent and brave soldiers. They carried the burden and walked together toward glory.